Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Summit podcast. I'm here with Joe Blevins again. Joe and I have we've been down these roads before here at the Summit podcast, but I think we have something quite special for you here today. And so, super quick. I'm Greg Jaber. I write at Ed Wood Wednesdays, Joe's fantastic blog at the Dead Rights blog, and also the host here of the Ed Wood Summit podcast. I'm a rather avid Ed Wood fan, perhaps you might say. And my friend Rob Huffman sent over to myself and Joe, maybe it had to have been 6 months ago or so. He sent over a couple of a short story and an article from an issue of a gallery press magazine from 1973 titled Goddess. So the cover as well as the short story and article. And it was priceless to get these scans because as yet, these two items have yet to appear in any of the great compilation books that we've seen of short stories and articles that Joe has reviewed at length at the Dead Rights blog. In fact, he reviewed every single one of the short stories and articles across the first three compilations thus far. We can only hope that there's more compilations. We can only hope that these two particular items work their way into a future compilation so that you can all read them. But we're going to talk about them here today. So again, I want to thank Rob Huffman. I wish he could have been here with us, but I kind of rushed us onto the calendar and didn't give him a lot of options, unfortunately. But I'll have Rob back here. Rob was here with me at the Ed Wood Summit podcast talking about Ed's potential involvement in France books and France magazines, and we're going to be back to talk about that subject. And certainly, Rob will be back here to talk about other things as well.
Hi, I'm Joe Blevins. I'm the founder of the Ed Wood Wednesdays series at d2rights.blogspot.com. And Rob, what can I say, man? You found a couple of incredible gems. To me, it is astonishing that these two articles have not yet appeared in any of the anthologies because, as I was saying to Greg before the show, if you go looking through the magazines from the 1970s, looking for Ed Wood's writing, the articles that we're about to cover today, a short story and a nonfiction-ish article, are exactly what you're hoping for. These stories are very, very typical of Ed Wood's signature style. A lot of his pet themes and phrases are in them, and they are wacky and loony in that kind of unique Ed Wood way. You can imagine him being completely wasted and typing these very, very fast on his typewriter and getting them to Bernie Bloom, his editor. What can I say? These are great stories. I really want people to know about these because these are so much fun. I can't believe I didn't know about them before because every time you think, oh, well, I've seen it all in the Ed Wood literary canon, you find stuff like this. Stuff like this keeps popping up in your life. And you think, well, you got to keep going because you find stuff like this. You find wonderful things like what Rob has found for us.
Indeed. So the story. Let's start with the story. So we've got Thor and his magic hammer, and so yes, this is in fact the Thor you know of, the god of thunder. Although it veers off relatively quickly into very personal sort of matters that are of greater interest to Ed than actually the mythology, so to speak. And it's curious. It's even a little puzzling to me, Joe. What was he even trying to? Why even wrap it into the mythology he's talking about? Ultimately, his very favorite sort of issues, wearing women's clothing, the sexual, the sexual tension between men and women in a relationship. It's very typical Ed Wood. But
Right.
yeah, this is so much fun. It's only what, about 2,000 words. It's a
Yeah,
mere
it's very short.
right.
It's a wisp of a story. And I was thinking, I couldn't remember any specific stories that I had reviewed from Goddess magazine, which was a gallery press magazine. This one came out in like May and June. This was like May, June 1973. I was wondering if perhaps Ed took that title Goddess and he wanted to write something very, very literal.
Right.
And a lot of the of Bernie Bloom's magazines, they would have a gimmick, or they would have one particular fetish or something, like it would be garter girls or something. Um, and I was wondering, what could possibly the hook be for a magazine called Goddess? What is that magazine about? And maybe Ed didn't know either. So if he said, well, I got to write something for Goddess magazine, might as well write about a Norse god who somehow hooks up with the girlfriend of a Greek god. That's what this. Well, you can explain the story a little bit.
Sure. Well, it's fairly simple. Very simply, as we open, Thor is talking to his dad, Odin,
Mhm.
and he's bemoaning the fact that he's intimidating to women because
Yeah.
of his sexual power. And when he has sex with women on planet Earth, when he comes down to Earth from the clouds, they just
They're
can't
just
take that level of intensity, I guess, of the mighty hammer.
and they're
And so he's bemoaning that fact, and his dad gives him a little bit of advice. Odin gives him a little bit of advice and says, "Look, you maybe want to consider." Well, first he tells him, "Consider perhaps dressing in more feminine clothing." That might
yes.
be less intimidating for women. And then subsequently gives him the advice that find a woman who can match you sort of bit for bit in terms of the level of sexual intensity. So his dad gives him, I think, two really fine pieces of advice.
Right.
Yeah.
And so uh, Thor, the god of thunder, and of course, thunder and lightning being Ed Wood's lifelong, career long obsessions. And I think this might be the high point of Ed's obsession with thunder, is actually having the god of thunder in one of his stories, takes human form and comes down to earth in a way that reminded me of Arnold Schwarzenegger in the movie Hercules in New York. If you've seen that film, where Hercules takes human form and comes down to earth and has a very silly adventure. Now, I thought that maybe because he was coming down to earth, he was going to be coming down to earth in the swinging 1970s, and he was going to have to deal with 70s stuff like traffic and the free love movement and drugs, and I didn't know what was going to happen, but nothing like that happens. It takes place in ancient times. The whole thing takes place in ancient times. Although, as we were talking about before the show, the language of this story is all over the place. Uh, in some ways, Thor and Odin speak in a kind of elevated pseudo British style. They use words like milady and bedchambers to give it a sort of a pseudo masterpiece theater, I Claudius kind of vibe. But as you pointed out, when it comes time to do the jokes in this story, and there are a few, Ed loves that kind of ribald humor. They'll just go into very contemporary slang. And it does not seem to concern Ed at all that Thor and Odin are from Norse mythology and Achilles is from Greek mythology. Basically, he comes down to earth and he hooks up with Achilles' mistress, I guess we'll call her. Her name is Andralia. And if in case you're thinking, wow, I took some mythology classes in college, I don't remember Andralia, because she's not there. Ed is making her up. He's mixing and matching his mythology and adding a little bit of his own. So we get Thor, we get Odin, we do not get Achilles. Achilles is off hunting down Hector, his enemy, of course. But Achilles' girlfriend is still home, and I guess Thor just kind of shows up and starts talking with her, and
he just sort of shows up. And he also, in a way, even though he's a deity and this is a human woman, she fairly quickly takes takes the reins in this relationship
Yeah.
very, very quickly, as a matter of fact. So Andrelia puts him in his place rather quickly. It tells him, hey, I have relationships with Achilles, with other
Any
people.
man.
I'll do whatever I want to do, essentially. So gets him a little bit back on his heels, and even encourages him to wear a purple silk dressing gown, a female attire, because
Yes.
Achilles likes to wear that as they make love. So she talk about really a bold statement, right? You're
Well,
going to now have to sort of find yourself in the shoes of my lover who's away at war. So so it's in a way that it's emasculating also, right?
well, this magazine again is called Goddess, so maybe they're trying to have more strong female characters. And in his conversation with Odin near the beginning of the story, Thor and Odin talk about the fact that Achilles plays with the girls almost as much as he plays with the boys.
Yeah.
And so we have a bisexual Achilles and perhaps a cross-dressing Achilles. And so then we take Thor and we have him cross-dressing. And of course, the Thor's concern is that he will split the seams of any out that he is put into because he is so large. But apparently they worked something out because I think he actually, but a really interesting aspect of Andrelia taking the reins is that Andrelia has to be Thor's sexual teacher in a lot of ways. And she teaches him a few things that he had no experience with, including kissing. And if you've read any of Ed Wood's fiction, you know that the lashing, slashing tongues are one of Ed's favorite images. God knows why. It's never described in a pleasant way. It always, I think he even mentions saliva in this story. He likes to get right up in there. And so Thor is learning how to kiss, I would say French kiss, from Andrelia. And I was thinking, what a wonderful reversal this is, because usually it's the man who is teaching the woman about sex. In most fiction, in most literature, especially erotic, it's always the man teaching the woman. So in this case, Thor is, because I guess he lives up in the clouds all the time, he is not up on the ways of lovemaking on Earth. And the fact that Thor lives in the clouds actually gets Ed to one of his other favorite metaphors, because when people are in a joyous or a state of ecstasy in Ed's novels or short stories, he often describes them as being up in the clouds. He doesn't get to say pink clouds in this story because he loves to say pink clouds in his novels, but they are transported to the clouds. And Andrelia not only teaches him kissing, but then they move on to another act, which Thor was completely unfamiliar with. Which was oral. He's never had oral. He's never had that experience in his life. So I don't know what Thor was doing with his previous girlfriends. I don't even know that you'd call them girlfriends. He's just out there basically just terrifying women and having sex with them.
Right.
And he's tired of women being terrified. So Andrelia is not terrified of him. And
No.
that's good. Do you think Ed would have wanted to film this if he could? Do you think Ed would have?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Sure. Why not, right? Why not,
Well,
right? Would have been interesting. That being said, though, Joe, let's make the point. This is entirely almost dialogue driven.
Yes.
There's no descriptive passages whatsoever. Ed has zero interest in trying to sort of paint the realistic picture of this mythology. He has no interest in it whatsoever.
No, it's all talk. It's one where people are constantly explaining everything to each other through dialogue. As we were saying, there's not really even a good sense of where all of this is taking place. other than that, at the beginning, they're up in the clouds, and for the rest of the story, he's down on Earth. But yeah, I don't think Ed was wanting to pause in the middle of his writing session to think about these things. He doesn't bother to set the scene because, well, I was thinking about that. I think Ethan Coen of the Coen brothers pointed out that the Bible almost never bothers to set the scene or describe characters or describe settings at all. If things are happening, it's because characters are saying something to someone else, and it's all dialogue driven. So, and Shakespeare as well. You don't in the scripts for Shakespeare's plays, you don't hardly get any description at all. It's all dialogue driven. So, I'm going to let Ed off the hook here for that because, yeah, it's really all based on what the characters are saying to each other. But I think Ed is having fun writing this kind of elevated dialogue.
You certainly place him in good stead, Joe, right?
Well, yes,
the Bible,
and Shakespeare and Ed Wood. Well, I was thinking, the character of Thor obviously goes back to Norse mythology, but the Thor that we know best is, of course, from Marvel Comics. And that version, which was a collaboration between Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, that goes back to about 1962. And by 1973, when this story is coming out, that version of Thor is very much a public icon because of the comic book covers. And I was saying that this story took me back to my childhood because my father taught at a school called Flint Northern High School in Flint, Michigan, and their mascot is the Vikings, or was the Vikings. The school is now closed. And when I would visit him at his job, I was always astonished because there was a huge mural of the Marvel Thor painted on glass when you would come in. And so I was already, as a kid, I was already a Marvel Comics and DC Comics junkie. So I'd be astonished to see this Thor character. And this would have been, mid to late 1970s when I was seeing this. And I think Ed Wood would be astonished at where the Marvel Thor has gone in the last 10, 15 years because of the MCU movies. Now Thor is incredibly, incredibly well known and incredibly popular. And is it possible to read the story and not think of the Marvel Thor? For me, it wasn't. I immediately thought of the Chris Hemsworth version of the character, but that makes it even more enjoyable. I think there are a handful of times in Ed Wood's writing career when he really wants to be fanciful, when he really goes off on a tangent. He really goes for it, and he goes for something that's wildly into the realm of fantasy. And this is an example of Ed being wildly in the realm of fantasy. It has no connection, really, not really, with life on Earth, or in direct contrast to the article by Ed that's in this same issue of Goddess magazine, which is very much focused on earthly concerns and earthly issues. This is a story about a god, and maybe the entire point of this story, as you might have guessed from the title, Thor and his magic hammer, is to use that metaphor of the hammer and how Thor wields his mighty hammer. And believe me, Ed does not leave any stone unturned there. Any possibility for using this metaphor as the metaphor of Thor's magic hammer as a sexual metaphor. Every time that comes up as a possibility, Ed uses every possible version of it, including ways at the end that I don't know that I entirely understood, because the story gets more sort of dreamy as it goes along and more fanciful, because Andrelia, having had a wonderful days-long, or was it weeks affair with their lovemaking goes on for quite a long time with Thor. I think it goes on for days or weeks. She wants to go back up to the clouds with Thor.
Yeah.
And then you get a very interesting dialogue, because Thor starts saying about, well, I would have to clear it with Odin, my father. And and she's like, a big boy like you has to clear things with his father. And she says, well, he's the god of everything. He makes the law. And then Thor does something which I don't think I understand what's actually happening. He points his magic hammer toward the skies or something, and then he places his magic hammer inside of Andralia, and she says she now knows what it's like to be on the clouds where Thor reigns supreme or something. I was like, I'm not sure where you're going with this metaphor at this point, but it's written, I think, in a state of ecstasy. I think this story is written in a state of ecstasy, and it's the way Ed was. Well, I always like to think of Ed as being very passionate when he writes. Of course, he's known for his frantic typing, and I can imagine him just really getting more and more intense. And this story has sort of the building of like Ravel's Bolero. It's just da 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 da, and it's getting louder and louder and louder as it goes along. And now I've played Ravel's Bolero in concert, and it's very repetitive, but it's also very exhausting because once you start, you don't get to pause. It just keeps building up and up and up, and you're supposed to be playing the same thing basically over and over, but you're playing it louder and louder and louder until by the end it's very loud indeed, to match the rhythm of lovemaking. And that's what this story is. It sort of builds up to this incredible climax. And I have to wonder if Ed Wood was stimulated in his own way by his own writing, because he put so much of his own interests and his own kinks and his own likes into this. We've talked about the purple satin robe. We've talked about fluff. We've talked about the cross-dressing. And one of the key words to know about Ed, one of the key adjectives is soft. Ed loves soft things. And so Thor, I believe, begins to love soft things or enjoy the feeling of soft things. And the whole point of it is that, here you have Thor, the icon of masculinity, and now he's learning to enjoy. Now he's learning to enjoy the softer side of life, and that is what actually. And that's what brings him to like his next level sexually. He was at this very, very elementary level.
Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am type of guy, right?
Exactly. And now he's learning. And I thought it was quite positive for Ed to have the woman being the one teaching him. So
for sure. Right.
Yeah. So
even though he's the deity,
right.
very quickly it's established in their dialogue as they get to the precipice of actually starting to have sex with one another that first off she begins to fondle him, and he's immediately worried about him ejaculating more or less immediately. So the god could also be a premature ejaculator.
Yes.
Right.
That is a point that he makes, that he doesn't want to climax too soon. He does worry about that. And she says, and so it's interesting to see this side of that of the character. It'll certainly make you think differently about the next Thor movie that you watch, or the next Thor comic book that you read, that even he has these problems along these lines. It's one of the rare, there's sometimes Ed's erotic, quote unquote, erotic stories can often take a very disturbing turn, or one where and as we will see in the article that was in the same issue, of the man forcing himself on women, or basically blackmailing women, which is what we'll basically come to. It's good to see a story from Ed that is about consensual sex that is enjoyed by both partners, where the woman has a lot of agency in this story.
Right.
So I'm glad that he wrote this for Goddess. And I think a story like Thor and his magic hammer, and like, of course, I have to say that a couple of days ago, I was watching the Chuck Jones cartoon of What's Opera Doc, and of course that has Spear and Magic Helmet, Spear and Magic Helmet, and now I'm thinking of Thor and Magic Hammer, Thor and Magic Hammer. Uh, so this is one of those stories that would be a gem to any Ed Wood compilation, and I'm surprised that it has not ever been anthologized before. Not in the three of Bob's books, and there was another book that had come out many years ago called Wood
Shortwood, right, by Ramble
from
House.
Woodpile, yeah, the Ramble House Press, uh, and we should point out this is not a speculative or
Oh, no,
maybe.
right.
No, this is Ed Wood puts his own real name on this one and in big letters. So this was one where I don't know why sometimes Ed puts his own name on things and then doesn't put his own name on things other times, but this is one where this one is stamped with the Ed Wood official seal of approval. So this is as official an Ed Wood story as you're going to get.
For sure.
He puts his absolute real name.
Even if we didn't have a name on it, Joe, honestly, right?
Well,
It's unmistakable. It's
oh yeah,
unmistakably Ed. Yeah.
when he's talking about the purple silk nightgowns, and we were talking about his use of words like lovely and thrills
Thrills and
and
thrilling. Yeah.
thrills and thrilling and fluff
Delight.
and
He
delight.
he uses thunder as a verb early on in the story.
Oh,
Thor thunders, which is one of the reasons why he's having difficulty in his sexual relationships, because he brings too much intensity to the
this was
situation for the average woman of
yeah.
Earth, right?
Well, okay. This was a sentence that I had to write down. For a dainty girl, she had the strength of a bull elephant when she was so sexed up. And I thought,
You can't mistake it, right?
that is the soul. That is the soul of Ed Wood's writing. So even if it didn't have his name on it, it would be pretty easy to spot this, but it does have Ed Wood's name on it. And it's, again, this is the kind of story that you hope to find when you're looking through Ed's writing. So this is a beautiful find. So Rob, God bless you, man.
Indeed. Rob did, by the way, after I proposed that we did. Well, Rob initially brought these stories to the table or this story in the article to the table for us a little while back, and I finally just a couple of days ago shot Rob and Joe an email, and I said, "Hey, let's talk about this. What do you think? Let's talk about this one." So again, apologies. Putting it out there so quickly, getting this together so quickly that Rob couldn't be with us, but I'm sure he's going to watch this back, and certainly, hopefully, he will absolutely enjoy it. But yeah, I was charmed by this story, if that's the right word for it. It is very fun and frothy and upbeat. It is 2,000 words that you'll probably be able to rip through in the space of about 6 or 8 minutes, and that won't really won't really tax you in any way, but actually just bring a smile to your face.
Yeah, this is what this is what you're hoping for when you look for an Ed Wood story. It has everything that you want, and the fact that it brings in these elements of mythology, which why on earth was Ed inspired that day to write, other than the magazine being called Goddess? Maybe that was what tipped him off. But this is a wonderful find. And before I also want to point out that we were talking about the magazine that this came in. This was called Goddess magazine.
Yeah.
And this was from Gallery Press. This was one of
Bernie Bloom's.
Bernie Bloom, sorry.
So
Bernie Bloom's.
after Bernie Bloom starts Pendulum Press at the West Coast office, funded by Michael Thieves, who had started Pendulum in Atlanta prior to that in the mid 1960s, and Michael Thieves starts to get into some serious legal hot water for things like arson and murder, and in fact, he lands on the FBI's 10 most wanted list at some point. At which point, Bernie starts to shift things up and essentially divest himself of the Pendulum imprint, and Gallery Press Publishers is something he starts up to get away from that potential albatross of working with Michael Thieves. And so galleries, what about 73 is exactly when I think
Yes.
gallery comes into play. Right prior to that, we have pendulum and calga. The calga being for California and Georgia, the postal abbreviations at the time for California and Georgia, calga, which was the two pendulum offices across the country coming together, the California and Georgia
Oh,
operation out of Atlanta.
well, what surprised me about this magazine is that it's $3.50
Yeah.
in um, in 1973 money, which translates to over $26 today. So imagine paying $26. But what you get for your money, not only are fine articles and stories by Ed Wood, but you get on the cover a really, really great picture of Renee Bond, who I always say made more movies with Ed Wood than Bela Lugosi, which I believe she and Ed worked more times together than Ed and Bela.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's a great picture. She is, as you pointed out, wearing her belly chain. She and her partner Rick Lutz, I guess, had, you said, matching belly
Yes,
chain,
in some films they have matching belly chains. Not in Necromania, we don't see the belly chains, but in other films, yeah.
and she's wearing a blonde wig. She's wearing a rather unconvincing but still flattering blonde wig, and I think Renee has followers just of her own. I think people would uh, collect Renee Bond sort of memorabilia or try
Yeah,
to find her. She did so much modeling work and so many films that I think it would be very difficult to track down all of it. But in a way that makes it interesting to the collector or to the fan, because you'll never run out of things to look for Renee, because she did so much in such a short span of time.
right.
And 1973 is one of those hugely prolific years for Ed, when he's just working and working and working and working and working on all kinds of projects, including even softcore features. You know, he and Steve Apostoloff are still working together at that time. So um,
You're right. A hugely prolific year, I would say, 72 through 72, 73. They could be the pinnacle of his level of productivity in terms of
yeah,
not only writing short stories, articles. We've only seen these scans of these couple of pieces from this particular issue, but stands to reason if you've seen other
yeah,
Bloom publications from this era, Ed more than likely would have written the editorial. He would have written
right,
uh, text that accompanied the photo features. He would have written other ancillary pieces. In some cases, you start leafing through a Pendulum Calga gallery press mag from that era, and you're like, he wrote the whole damn fucking issue. He wrote it
right,
all. Yeah,
yeah. Um, well, I always say, for Bernie Bloom, Ed was like, people often have like the good pair of scissors or something, the one that
yeah,
really
right,
works.
right,
And for Bernie, Ed was the good pair of scissors. He was like, because guys would come through the pendulum office and uh, maybe wouldn't be able to produce on that level, or produce consistently, or would just simply plagiarize stuff. And for so for Bernie, a guy like Ed was just a godsend, because he could just churn out pages and pages of text.
right.
And I would have to think that I don't know how well all this stuff works as erotica. Maybe guys are identifying with Thor, the God of Thunder.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, the average gentleman who picked up this magazine paid a pretty penny for it. Would he have
Yeah.
really stopped uh, dead in his tracks, actually read this story and absorbed it and considered it, or would he have fairly quickly moved on? Maybe the Thor
Well,
angle was a draw because of the comic book. It would have been recognizable. But
well,
at some point, as they get a little deeper into the article, you have to be, or the story rather, you have to be thinking to yourself that they're probably thinking, "What is happening here?" Right?
yeah, they're starting to think like, okay, this is a power fantasy. You have a
Yeah.
Norse god, but now you have him wearing the purple nightgown. And what's this about playing with the boys as well as the girls,
Right.
and him getting interested in soft things, and the woman taking the lead, and him being sexually naive. So this is an example of where Ed takes this material and he suits it for Ed. I think Ed was his own audience, his own best audience. So that's why you don't get stories like Thor and his magic hammer from any other writer.
No.
Uh, so yeah, I don't know if Ed was all that good at writing effective erotica that would work for other people. He wrote it to suit himself. So
Right.
and that's what's wonderful about these. That's what's wonderful about these stories is that they're just from Ed's. They're just
It
from
makes
Ed's
them so
subconscious.
right. They're so utterly unique. One other thought on this particular story is it's in a way it's Thor's a sort of coming of age sexual
Mm-hmm.
story for Thor. He's presented talking to his dad early on, a little bit like he's a little bit the teenager, and
Yeah.
he's being ushered into something the adult world via sex with somebody who is obviously a lot more experienced than him, despite the fact that she's just a human and he's a deity. So so that did you take it, Joe? The final line of the story is a
Okay.
bit the syntax of the line is a little bit odd, but it seems to suggest that Andrelia is now has succeeded in convincing Thor that she wants to become a deity, and she has joined him and Odin and others in the clouds.
See, that's why I said I didn't understand the ending.
Yeah,
Whether Ed was just describing some sort of orgasmic state that they had reached down there on Earth, after he does whatever he does to his
I kind of
magic
took it.
hammer.
I took it literal that she is now a deity along with I
Okay,
don't
so
know. I mean, that's just how I took it.
I guess he just brings her up like, "Hey, Dad, I brought my girlfriend along, and she's now just like living up in. I guess
Right?
she's now living up in Asgard. I guess I don't
I
know.
don't know, which will leave it.
She.
Achilles will come home to find no one there.
Oh, hey.
So yeah, yeah, I
So
don't know.
yeah, that's why I said the story gets very dreamy and sort of more metaphorical as it goes along. It sort of loses the linear narrative, but that's another trait of Ed's is that even if he starts on what seems to be a coherent linear narrative, this happens, so this happens, so this happens, it's very possible that he will venture off into dreamland basically, or basically get so metaphorical or so abstracted that it doesn't really cohere as a narrative by the end. So that's what happens here. I think he wrote this story. That's why the story is so short. I think he just was like, he just built to this climax and it was like, I got to back away from the typewriter. That was it.
Right.
I came up with this last line and what else am I going to say? So yes, perhaps Andrelia, this made up character, and where he came up with that name, which doesn't even seem to be that common.
The only thing I can think of androgyny, right? The
Sure.
only even remote connection I could think to the
Right.
name, but that plays no part. Well, it does in a way. It plays a
In a
part in the
way.
story, right? So that's Thor and his magic hammer. So yes, Ed accomplished all that again in a mere couple thousand words, and lots lots to sort of think about and lots to sift through. So now we'll jump over to in the same issue of Goddess, an article by Dick Trent. So we know,
Oh, yes.
of course, this is one of Ed's more commonly used pseudonyms, and without doubt, there's literally no doubt here as well that this is for sure an Ed Wood article. This is even more brief. This is only a couple of pages.
Nice.
He probably dashed this off in the space of a half hour, right? Knowing how
Well,
fast he could type.
yes. And this was another one where I think he goes into sort of a fugue state and just he starts typing. Uh, but this is so Ed Wood that it almost reads like somebody aping Ed's style or
Yeah,
writing as a parody of Ed Wood. He's known for his ellipses a lot of times. And you can tell when his mind is sort of getting fuzzy because he'll really abuse the ellipses and the italics and things. And the random italicization of words or putting in a lot of ellipses.
share
And
share
that
share Joe. The title with us is
oh
worth.
yes,
Yes.
I should mention this is one of Ed's greatest titles in the history of Ed's writing. It's called Girls Who Have to Watch Their Periods as Well as Their Commas. And Ed loved that kind of raunchy, disgusting wordplay, because this is theoretically a how-to article for secretaries, for aspiring young secretaries. And if you've watched Ed's movies from the 70s, or if you've read any of Ed's fiction from the 60s and 70s, you know what he thinks the function of a secretary in an office is basically a prostitute. Basically, you're there, but you are supposed to be able to take dictation and shorthand, and you're supposed to do all the secretarial duties, but you are also supposed to
you should type minimally 60 words per minute. If you know how to work a switchboard, it's probably a bonus, even though generally in most offices you may not have to work the switchboard. So yeah, he goes enumerates all the abilities they teach in secretarial school, or quote unquote finishing school. With the exception of the most important thing to him of all, that they don't teach you in school.
Well, I was thinking about the title of this thing being about how girls who have to watch their periods. And of course, the reason why you watch your periods is that so you don't get pregnant. And when Ed writes about secretaries, I think on more than one occasion, he's written about one who is impregnated by her boss. And I think there's a novel called Nighttime Les, which it takes place in the office world. And that has a young woman who does get pregnant, and how does she handle that? And I think the guy who knocks her up is supposed to be sort of nice or sort of sympathetic, so you don't want his life to be ruined by having knocked up his secretary. Well, the other thing this reminded me of was Ed's script for The Cocktail Hostesses for Steve Apostoloff, which is also about a secretary who is banging her boss, and then she gets tired of that. She becomes a cocktail hostess and has all kinds of other adventures. But, and that, of course, stars Renee Bond, who's on the cover of this magazine, looking very much like she does in the movie. So this could practically be a guide to that movie. But yes, the secretarial schools teach you the basics of being a secretary, but they don't teach you how to, what was it, move your body or carry your
body carriage.
Yeah. And Ed does not judge at all the bosses who want to minimally look up the girl's skirt or anything like that, or
no, he takes it as it's just a fact. It's just normal. It's at face value. This is what happens.
This is how it works.
Yeah.
So, I don't now. Steve Apostoloff had a whole movie called Office Love-In, of course, where there's all kinds of erotic shenanigans going on in the offices, and we've heard these stories of these bacchanalian office parties from the 60s and 70s. I don't know what the office world was like back then. I've worked in a lot of offices myself, and I can promise you that they are nothing at all like this. And even what you see in a TV show like The Office, the NBC sitcom, is light years beyond what would be possible.
Joe, it reminds me of a coworker of mine. I work remotely now due to the the pandemic and the world of the post-pandemic. It still persists that we work remotely. But when I worked in the office, I was hired by a lady who became good friends with me about 12 years ago at the place where I currently work. And she was a little bit older than me, and we became friends over time and really got to know one another. And she would tell me stories. She would say, she'd worked there at this point for 25 30 years or something like that, since going back to the 1980s. She would say, you wouldn't believe it, but even then, when I was younger, you had to go through it every now and then, where literally the boss was chasing you around the desk. Like, it was a common, it's a more, I think Ed knows it's a common practice, and he's copping to it very matter-of-factly. It's obviously a terrible thing, right?
Well, right now I am, very coincidentally, I'm rereading Confessions of a Dangerous Mind by Chuck Barris. Now, this is the book where he claims to have been a CIA agent and game show host, basically. He was like masquerading as a game show host when he was really a CIA agent. and I don't think that it's true, but it makes a very entertaining novel. But he was at that time running a production company to produce the dating game, the Newlywed Game, the Gong Show, and all these other programs. And he talks very candidly in the book about having affairs with secretaries and people who work on his shows. And like, he'll just say in the book, like, I'm trying to bang this new receptionist who's just come to work on the Gong Show or something. And very unapologetic about it. And so this is all taking place in the 1960s and 1970s. So yeah. Apparently at that time, maybe it was the way things are at these places. I think at Bernie Bloom's office, from everything I've read, it seems like it was pretty much as they say, a sausage fest going on there. I don't know that there were women actually working.
No, I never picked that up either. Right.
So
they punched the time clock, went into the little cubicle, and they spent all day there, typing away or dawdling the day away, hoping they wouldn't get caught by Bernie, wasting time on the clock. Yeah.
So I don't think there were like cute secretaries there being groped and fondled, but he very much compares it to the casting couch. He even explicitly says it's like the casting couch. But the most disturbing, now we said that the Thor and his magic hammer stays away from the more disturbing aspects of Ed Wood's sexuality. This story, the girls who have to watch their periods, wallows in it for a little while. There's a part about basically if the girl says no, that she might just be raped. And he says not the down and dirty kind of rape, but more like the subtle kind of rape. And he describes what the subtle rape is, which is basically what I would call sexual blackmail. Basically, the guy is coercing.
You want to keep your job? Do you want to even get hired in the first place? Right.
Well, I do work in an office, and through this process, I've had to sit through many sexual harassment training seminars, and of course, you have to sit through these movies. And of course, these are they play these scenarios out, where it's a quid pro quo, I think is the term that they use. It's a quid pro quo sexual thing. Like if you want this promotion, if you want to keep your job, et cetera, et cetera. And they're, of course, presenting it as something horrible, something never to do. And Ed is presenting it as just something that's completely normal. Right. And here he actually does mention, he, of course, lingers on what the women are wearing. This is where he finally gets in an Angora reference. He talks about girls wearing a low-cut Angora sweater. And he's even on the side of the sort of the chauvinist sexual harasser bosses, because he says, that they don't want, quote unquote, some dumpy looking broad. And I was thinking, well, some broad is another one of Ed's pet words. So you have this,
it's a bad look. Even the client, even for the sake of the clients, if nothing else, right? Even the clients need to have a pretty girl at the desk. Yeah, in skimpy clothing. The finishing school tells you to wear certain kind of clothing that is not what you really want to wear in the office. It's a little bit too conservative.
Yes. So I'm not, so maybe some of this is actually rooted in the truth of that era. I'm sorry to women who had to live through it, but so as I was saying, there's that NBC sitcom that still gets rerun all the time called The Office, and the characters on that show occasionally are having there are tons of relationships between the characters, of romantic and sexual relationships between the characters, and some of them occasionally will sneak off and actually have trysts, like somewhere in the building, or and then the boss, who's Michael Scott, he would make very sexually suggestive references to his female employees, and does that just casually. He does, like, not even thinking about it. And people have pointed out, if you really did that, you would have been fired in like 2 seconds. So I can say that in one office where I worked in Chicago, um, the real danger would come on the holidays, because they would have holiday like Christmas parties and things like that, because people would drink to excess. They would drink in just incredible amounts. I don't think that ever comes up in Ed's story, even though booze was one of Ed's muses. Booze doesn't ever come up, I don't think, in this secretary story.
No.
But because you have to think that some of this carnal activity is being fueled by something, and it's probably alcohol. Well, when the people would go, I mean, you've never seen people drink like people who work in an office and have like a Christmas party or any opportunity to drink. And if you give, God, we had a Cinco de Mayo party where there was people crawling around on the floor.
Right?
So if people who work in an office, it's a very boring and a very stultifying life. So if you give them alcohol, that is a deadly combination. So we actually did have at least one person fired after a Christmas party, not because he did anything, but just because he said some stuff. I don't think he would have gotten away with doing anything, but just saying stuff was enough to get you.
We had a party. Well, it was like an awards presentation type of thing where we go out to a restaurant, and some of the people who had been doing their jobs exceedingly well, we're gonna give them awards, and we're all gonna eat together. And of course, we were imbibing. This is quite a while ago, by the way, but that party never happened again subsequently, because one gentleman drank about 3 or 4 bottles of wine to the point where he couldn't even stand up. And so he torpedoed it for the rest of us. Going back to this particular article, Joe, there's actually Miss Jones is the
yes. I was one
right, Miss Jones, and she's a virgin. She's a virgin.
Yes.
So and Ed actually takes the time to paint
one character,
3 different kinds of women in this office circumstance.
3 different kinds of women, but one named character.
Right, one named character, Miss Jones, who's the virgin. Then there's the woman who knows what's happening. Miss Jones is naive. She didn't learn this in finishing school. The next character he describes is somebody who knows what's happening and is sort of soft pedal along the way, and knows that ultimately she's going to have to go along with this, but doesn't do it quite so willingly. And then there's the third kind of woman who knows the game right out of the gate. Now, Miss Jones actually gets offered by the employment director after her interview, because she's so naive and doesn't understand what's happening. He offers her a little bit more money, a little bit more perks than the woman who immediately just falls into having sexual relations within the office, because she knows that's ultimately what it's all about. So she loses out in terms of her earning potential. So the virgin makes the most money right out of the gate.
Well, I think Ed here is reveling in the idea of taking the virgin Miss Jones and maybe dirtying her up a little bit. It's sort of like taking the angel and dragging her through the mud. And it shows you maybe how Ed's views have kind of corrupted since even the 60s, because that was around 65 or so. I will say 1965 is when he probably wrote Hollywood Rat Race. And there you have the innocent young girl who comes to Hollywood to be a star, and she's led astray by Mr. Sleazy, and there it's the Sleazemeister who gets the name Mr. Sleazy. And Ed is against this. This is like, watch out for Mr. Sleazy. And harkens back again to the Sinister Urge, where you have the other innocent young lady who tries to get into the motion picture business, and Johnny Ride, or whatever his name is, the sleazy film producer, is taking advantage of her. And again, this is a cautionary tale. So you have Sinister Urge and Hollywood Rat Race, which are cautionary tales for the young lady. Like, of course, his advice throughout that whole book, Hollywood Rat Race, is stay home.
Don't go to Hollywood. Yep.
Don't do it, because Mr. Sleazy is going to find you, and you're going to end up probably getting raped, or at least sexually harassed. That term wouldn't have been known to Ed, but he would understand what it is. And that was like mid 60s. By 1973, it was toot toot, all aboard, full speed ahead, let's go.
Right.
Let's get on with the sexual harassment. So this is the opposite of the goddess mentality that we'd been seeing in the other story, where you have a strong female character. Here, it's the best that I can say is that you know how in Death of a Salesman, I don't know if you're familiar with
Sure.
Death of a Salesman, but Willie Loman has affairs with women on on the road because he's a traveling salesman. And one thing I remember reading about one of the women who describes herself as being like a football. He gives his son a football, and she says, "I feel like a football too. That's me." Is that in a world dominated by men, she holds her own. Like she realizes that having sex with guys like Willie is just part of the life, and she owns up to it and lives with it, because it would be foolish to try and fight this kind of world. And Willie talks to a lot of women, talks to women generally throughout that whole play. He talks to them in sort of what now would be called an inappropriate way. He will be inappropriately flirtatious or condescending or overly sexual, with them. And at least, I guess, Ed is saying, like, to women, I don't know if women are reading this magazine, but this is the reality. You might as well get used to it and own it. And I think that is exactly what's happening in Cocktail Hostesses, because Renee Bond's character, she maybe doesn't want to screw her cadaverous looking boss. There's this guy, I think his name is Norman Fields. And he has this very gaunt appearance. I don't know why he was in adult movies, but he was. I'm sorry, Norman, if you're still alive. I'm sure you're not, because you look like you died 5 minutes after that movie got finished making. But her character has resigned herself to the fact, like, okay, this is how it is. This is the reality of business life. If I'm going to make it in this business world, I've got to make it in the business world. And maybe that's the best that a woman can hope for in Ed Wood's world.
You made me think, you remember the moment in Clute with Jane Fonda where we see the shot where over the shoulder, the gentleman, her John is having sex with her, and she's moaning and pretending like she's into it, and she very matter-of-factly looks at her. He doesn't see this. We're privileged as the audience, and we see that she just matter-of-factly looks at her watch. She's come to, well, she's a prostitute, obviously, but she's come to accept it. Yeah. But what we're talking about here is really quasi prostitution, right?
Basically, yeah, that you're considered to be, if you get hired for one of these jobs. Well, I was talking earlier about Chuck Barris. I had to bring it back to Chuck Barris for some reason. Had a game show that was so controversial, it was just, they had to take it off the air kind of very quickly, because he was always coming up with these very provocative and deliberately controversial ideas. And he had a game show called Three's a Crowd. And here is the premise. Who knows the man best, his wife or his secretary? And so they would bring the husband out, they would bring the wife out, they would bring the secretary out. And of course, the implication in every single episode was, of course, that the husband was having some kind of affair with the secretary. And Chuck has said, the wives hated that show, the husbands hated the show, the secretaries, he said, loved it. He said the secretaries were the only people having fun on Three's a Crowd. But this was so kind of beyond the pale, even for a Chuck Barris show, that they had to kind of take it. They had to take it off the air.
You took me way back, Joe. I haven't seen an episode of that show in quite some time, but you could find episodes, I think, on YouTube. Go check them out.
Yes.
It is a riot. That show is an absolute riot. I remember it from even when I was a little kid. Imagine me as you're a little kid and you're watching something like this. How do you even process it?
Like, it's absolutely unbelievable, because it's like one of those things, like, you can imagine Chuck just suggesting this at a meeting or something, and saying like that is in such bad taste that they have to do it. Now they revived the show years later with Alan Thicke, but then they watered down the concept. It would just be like two people who would know you, like your wife or your mother or something, or your wife or your friend, blah blah blah. The wife and the secretary thing, you obviously couldn't do that past the 19 we couldn't even do it in the 1970s. It would already been, it was too hot to handle even then. But yeah, that show, they used to run the real thing. They used to run the real one on Game Show Network, and that's where I saw it. And I was like, I can't believe this is a real thing. I can't believe this is a real show. But the implication always was that the husband must be having some kind of relationship with the secretary. And in maybe some of these cases it was true.
And the secretary, of course, knew the husband much better than the wife did. And the wife just has to sort of sit there in this moment of shock and embarrassment on television where she's being victimized in myriad ways. Right?
Well, that's another thing where Chuck is very he's very upfront about that. He would always say, like on the Dating Game and the Newlywed Game and the Gong Show, his purpose in a lot of these shows was to make the contestants as uncomfortable as possible. And it was always the embarrassment factor that he was going for. Like, how do we make this as tense as possible for them? How do we and in the movie Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, when it was made into a movie, he even draws his idea for the Newlywed Game is a picture of a guy with a car battery attached to his testicles. Basically, he's being shocked with a car battery to his testicles, and he says, "That's my idea for the Newlywed Game." So, but this secretary stuff, you would see it on Love American Style, or well, today I know the last vestige of this kind of material, and they even had to tone it down there. It's the comic strip Beetle Bailey and General Amos Halftrack and his secretary, Miss Buxley. And Miss Buxley is, of course, named because she's very buxom. And I think this was the last vestige of the boss sexually harassing the secretary kind of humor. I think that was the last place. And even General Halftrack eventually had to go to sexual harassment training. And now he can't say smutty stuff to Miss Buxley anymore. And they've given Miss Buxley like more of a personality. And now she's like going out with Beetle Bailey. And now she's, more of a fully rounded character. But fully rounded. She was always pretty well rounded. But, Mort Walker, the guy that drew Beetle Bailey, he was fully in it for the smut. He would write private Beetle Bailey comics just for himself. That were like X-rated. He would write X-rated Beetle Baileys just for his own amusement or for foreign publication. So I think that might be the last vestige of it. And a place where you can see the tide turning is on the sitcom WKRP in Cincinnati, where you have Mr. Carlson. He's the big boss. He's sitting behind a big wooden desk, in a big, well-appointed office. And he's got Lonnie Anderson, the blonde secretary, out in the lobby. And yet I don't think there is even like a hint of Mr. Carlson pursuing or chasing Lonnie Anderson, because he wouldn't do it. Right. So like if ever a person was going to do that. By the way, I mentioned the word blonde. I should point out that Thor in the first story has a thing for blondes.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that's another one of Ed's obsessions. He loves those blondes. And of course, the two of the most significant women in his life, Kathy Wood and Dolores Fuller. It's blonde hair. And of course, when he would dress as Shirley, he would wear a blonde wig. So maybe that's why he chose Thor as well, because as we all have seen in the comics and in the movies, Thor has the nicest blonde hair of any superhero you ever saw. So, he has, maybe that was something that appealed to Ed when he saw maybe a Thor comic book and he had this great mane of blonde hair. But
You reminded me of one other touch point. 9 to 5, the feature film Nine to
Oh,
Five, with Dabney Coleman playing the sexist boss, and of course
yes.
he gets his comeuppance quite hilariously.
Yes, that's a
I
very
think of
funny
that movie.
film.
It is really, really funny, and it was a huge box office smash because it touched on the zeitgeist at the time.
And that's where you're really seeing the tide start to turn. That's really where, like, again, Dolly Parton, blonde, you know, uh, would be the exact kind of person who is being victimized in the Ed Wood story, is now one of the people turning the tables in 9 to 5. And maybe 9 to 5 was kind of the end of that a trope in pop culture,
Right, right.
because there's rarely a film that's a more definitive end to to a trend than 9 to 5. 9 to 5 was there to say that is over. And how coincidental is it that one of the other stars of 9 to 5 is Jane Fonda,
Again,
Jane Fonda herself.
two
And of
two
course,
Jane Fonda referenced films here in today's podcast. Yeah.
well, it's a long way from, say, you from
Barbarella.
Barbarella
I knew you were going to
to
say that, right?
Clute
Right.
to 9 to 5. That is a long journey.
Mm-hmm.
That shows you how things had
To
really changed.
this, and then the current sitcom with Lily Tomlin
Lily
and Jane
Tomlin,
Fonda,
yeah,
what
yeah,
Frankie and Johnny, or I forget
something
what the
like
name.
that.
Frankie and Frankie and Grace. Thank you,
Frankie
Frankie
and
and Johnny.
Grace.
That was a Rick Lutz and Renee Bond film. Frankie and Johnny were lovers.
Well,
So, and that's of course based on something else,
well, you
but
see
yeah,
now. Well, now of course I have to work in a plug for my Happy Days podcast, because Gary Marshall also made a movie called Frankie and Johnny. So with I think Michelle Pfeiffer or something, I think was in it. So but yeah, if you see the evolution of Jane Fonda's career from the 60s to the 80s and beyond, you see how the role of women in pop culture, she's a test case for how the role of women in pop culture changed drastically. And so, yeah, the kind of world that Ed is describing in Girls Who Have to Watch Their Periods, and I got to give it up to that tasteless but wonderful
yeah,
pun. This is the kind of stuff that Ed really, I think, loves to do. People don't give Ed credit for having an intentional sense of humor. People always think that, oh, we're just laughing at Ed,
right.
and that Ed took himself so seriously. Ed thought everything he did was great art,
No.
and I said, no,
He's
that's not the
having a
way it
lot of
was.
fun. He's having a lot of fun with both of these pieces. In particular, Thor. He's definitely laughing along with us the whole entire way.
Yeah, Ed did not always take himself super seriously. Now, Glenn or Glenda, I believe he was very, very sincere and very serious. And in a way, Plan 9, there are passages in Plan 9 where I think, especially towards the end of that film, where he's being very, very sincere. When he's talking through Eros in that film, I think he's being very, very sincere. Um, but even in one of the documentaries, I forgot, I think this might be Look Back in Angora, where Kathy is talking about Ed trying to be serious, she even starts laughing because, Ed would try to be serious, but it wouldn't come out right. But never forget that Ed had a very much a playful side. Ed had a comedic side to his personality. There's a lot of intentional humor and a lot of intentional goofiness in his writing. And that's what makes these two wonderful pieces from Goddess Volume 2, Number 2 from 1973 so wonderful, is because I thought, boy, I had seen it all, man. I thought I had seen everything that Ed was capable of doing. And I thought, oh, great, two more of Ed's stories.
It begs the question, Joe, just how much more material's out there that we are not yet familiar with, that hasn't turned up or been widely distributed, even amongst
Well,
the fan community, because that's how essentially we even became aware of this.
right. I'm very, very grateful to the fan community, because
Yeah,
they're turning up stuff, and is worth turning over those rocks, basically.
Yeah.
And I'll say that one of the more, I didn't know what this project was about when you did it, but one of the more valuable things that you've done as part of the Ed Wood Wednesdays series, and you will remember this from a couple of years ago, is that you indexed all the Calga
Yeah.
and gallery magazines from
Yeah.
like 71, 72, 73, 74, 75. And I was like, I don't get quite why he's doing this. At the time, I didn't understand them. I will be honest, I didn't understand. But now I do
Good.
understand because
The scope of it is absolutely immense. That in and of
because
itself, right?
it gives you a place to look. It gives people like follow those articles, find them on Ed Wood Wednesdays, follow them at d2rights.blogspot.com. There's underneath the logo, it says
Yeah.
Ed Wood Wednesdays. Go to that page, scroll down, you'll find this whole section where Greg has indexed all these magazines
I think pretty much
from
from like 69 all the way through 75, maybe.
75. Yeah, I think
And
it goes from,
so the sweet spot of when he was most actively writing for magazines, certainly at least the
and
stuff he was writing for the Bloom produced magazines, and that was a pain in the ass. Now that you remind me of it, Joe. I mean, I went through
it's hard to
copyright
do, but
records to find those one by one by one, and there's over 600
well,
individual magazine titles and issues indexed there.
it's actually a very valuable resource for the for Ed Wood students, for people who are looking for his stuff. Greg has shown you where to look and what to look for on the market. Unfortunately, I think these magazines are getting very expensive,
They are.
which is a darn shame. Boy, if people should, if you were back in the 90s or whatever, and you were going to these used bookstores and stuff, I wish you'd picked up a bunch of them. There used to be a place in our hometown in Flint. There used to be a place called the Jelly Bean that sold used records and used books and used magazines and would sell adult stuff. They had a whole shelf of adult stuff of old magazines, and I'm positive that in there would have been gallery and Calga stuff in there,
Right.
and at ridiculously low prices, and I would have just been picking up all of them. But now it's out there in the world, and it's become the biggest game of where's Waldo in the world here. You have to go out, and now it's getting hard to find because I don't think eBay will let you sell this stuff anymore.
No, it's moved to off-site, off of eBay to some other more niche, discrete sites, less traffic. In some ways, I've actually, Joe, I've tried really hard to stay away from trying to start collecting the Pendulum magazines because it would come beyond my budget in no time flat. But I pick one up here and there, and I picked up scans over time, and I try to pick them up if I can when I can pick them up really cheaply. I bought like 5 Pendulum magazines a couple of months ago for $50. That's a phenomenal deal.
Yes, that's
I also conversely paid $65 a couple months ago for one magazine because it had an article about necromania in it, written by Ed, by the way. But
God bless Bob Blackburn. Because Bob has put a lot of money into buying all these magazines back, and I don't really need the magazines as physical objects. What Rob did for us here is all I need is to scan them and send me the articles, because I don't necessarily need a 50-year-old piece of paper. I just don't. I don't need it. What I would rather have is the text itself, and that's what we have here. And I was just saying before we started recording, I said my only regret about these 2 articles is that they're not illustrated. Because many of Ed's articles from the 70s are illustrated. And you said maybe we're missing like a splash panel. I would think that at least one of these 2 articles would probably have some kind of photo, or better yet, cartoon or illustration. That material I just love. I love when there's illustrations that go with these. And both of these stories would be very highly illustratable And I would love to see what an artist would think of. I don't know what's the guy's name, Phil Cambridge
Yeah, Phil Cambridge. Yeah, where
or
there's
El
Warpo
Warpo.
and a few others that yeah, that's a very nebulous subject.
That's a
The
whole
artists
world.
who drew for the Bloom magazines.
Well, that's a whole world to explore. Unfortunately, that stuff doesn't make it into the anthology books because Bob is very, very gun shy about putting that stuff in the magazines, in the books, because you never know what the rights are to that material. So unfortunately, the illustrations don't get out there as often as I can. I like to put that stuff on the blog. So if you look through my short story reviews, you'll find all kinds of pictures and articles and illustrations that were done with them. But yeah, this Thor story and even the secretary story would be great for illustrations purposes. But
for sure, for
yeah,
sure. Uh, one last thought. We're obviously at a good point to wrap this up. But one last thought. It would be wonderful that I do know of a handful of people who have quite extensively collected these Bloom related magazines. I've again accumulated a little bit myself in some wonderful ideal world that probably will never come to fruition, Joe. I would like to think that we can all bring our efforts together to bring to bear as much of this material as we possibly can.
yeah,
Because, yeah, Bob's done heroic work and the 3 volumes that have been put out thus far. But again, if you just look at one magazine, it's so far beyond that where you realize just the
yeah.
full extent of how much material Ed may have written is absolutely
Mhm.
staggering. And then you turn up gems like this and you realize
Yeah,
you can continue to dig and who knows what else may turn up.
yeah, this is the kind of thing that makes you want to keep digging and
Yeah.
makes people should motivate people to keep digging, because if you can find something like Thor and his magic hammer, or girls who have to watch their periods as well as their commas, oh, what a title. um, it motivates you to go on and find more.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why, is because there was only one Ed Wood in the whole world, and he was just churning out this stuff by the metric ton, and I don't know how he was doing it, but he writes this stuff like magic. Basically, he's just conjuring the stuff out of his typewriter, and it's unmistakably his. Both of these are absolutely unmistakably his. I would have been able to spot them from 100 miles away with no byline at all. Um, no one else in the world could have written these stories. Not only did Ed Wood write them, but no one in the world could have written them other than Ed. Nobody has that style, and I think people have tried to write in Ed's style, and it never really works. So yeah, this is the real deal stuff, man. This is the pure, uncut Brazilian, as they say. This is the pure stuff. So um, if yeah, these are just wonderful. So Rob, thank you,
Indeed,
man, for finding
indeed,
these.
indeed, and we'll certainly be back to talk about more. Hopefully, we'll find
Yeah,
more things of this level of interest. I'm sure we will. As a matter of fact, I feel confident that there's plenty more to discover in the body of work, the massive, extensive body of work produced by Edward D. Wood Jr. So I want to thank Joe for joining me here today. Certainly, again,
mhm.
one last shout out for Rob for bringing this to the
Wow.
table for us. And I want to uh, just say really quickly, we're obviously a little jocularity here as we're talking about in some cases what are fairly
Right.
sensitive subjects. So I just want to acknowledge that so that you don't think we're
No,
we're laughing along
no,
with Ed to a degree and looking at it
no.
through a lens of a point in time in the past when
Yeah,
a sad point in time in the past.
we do not approve of what goes on in the
Right, right,
secretary article.
right.
What goes on in the Thor article? Hell yeah, absolutely. Norse gods should come down to Earth, have sex with Earth women. Absolutely.
They should.
But
Yeah.
obviously the stuff that happens in the secretary article would be completely immoral, illegal. They would get you fired at least, and possibly some of the stuff imprisoned. So
Right.
absolutely, this is not a how-to manual for how to live your life in 2022. Don't even come close to attempting any of this stuff. It will have disastrous consequences on your life. Well, it should. So this is a, yeah, the secretary article is a remnant of a bad time in American history. So, but one that only Ed Wood could write.
Indeed. Indeed. Thanks again, Joe, for joining me here today. I hope all of you found this interesting. I hope you found it, as always, enjoyable and perhaps even a little bit beneficial. We'll certainly be back here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. Joe will be back with me. I'll make sure I get Rob here at the podcast with me, and I can acknowledge his contribution to him directly. And we'll talk about lots more. We've barely even all these years we're 10 years in, nearly 10 years in at Ed Wood Wednesday. Well, you're nearly 10 years in
10
now at
years
Ed
in,
Wood
but
Wednesdays. We've
yeah,
barely even begun to scratch the surface regarding Ed
yep,
Wood. We'll be
barely.
back. Thanks, everybody.